Hello and welcome to Motorsport Speak, the motorsport podcast brought to you by Motorsport Week and motorsportmonday.com. My name's Dan Lawrence, and as ever to talk all things Formula 1, I'm joined by our editor Taylor Powling, and we're talking about the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix, or just Formula 1 at Imola, as it's probably more affectionately known. It was a slow burner of a race, with Max Verstappen seemingly cruising to victory until a maybe brief but exciting end. The last 10 laps, Lando Norris charging and potentially taking back-to-back victories, but just coming up short. So we're going to talk all about that, and obviously it's a Formula 1 back-to-back as we're heading to the Principality of Monaco, or Monte Carlo, or whatever you want to call it, the jewel in the crown of F1 this weekend, so we'll preview that a little bit. But first, let's dive into Imola, Emilia Romagna Grand Prix, or whatever that really long, convoluted official name of the race is, made in Italy, blah, 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 which I can't remember or recall. But anyway, Taylor, how are you? And did you enjoy the race?
I'm good, thanks, Dan. Yeah, it was, as you put it, a bit of a slow burner, with a bit of excitement at the end, and kind of whetted our appetite for Monaco this weekend and the subsequent races. It's funny because we were talking during the races, we always do, and we were quite kind of divided on what we made of the end. You found it quite exciting, whereas I was a bit more subdued. And looking back, maybe I was a bit, downbeat on it because it was an exciting finish, but it's also because of the venue we are at. Imola, notoriously difficult to overtake on, and kind of seeing Piastri tucked up behind the Ferrari in a quicker car throughout the entire opening stint and not even really mounted an attack. Although Norris closed up on Verstappen at a rapid rate and Verstappen was genuinely struggling, I always kind of had that feeling that Verstappen had it covered and it wasn't a true kind of, chase for the win, because overtaking would have been so hard. You needed like a 0.8 second delta to make overtakes work this weekend, and that's why we saw most of the moves being cars that are pitted coming through on cars that were still on their starting tyres. But I think the main thing to take away from the race is not the actual race itself and how exciting that end pursuit from Norris was. It's more of a case of the fact that for the second consecutive race now, Red Bull have looked vulnerable. They've not got the car in the right window, and both McLaren and arguably Ferrari are there to properly challenge them, and that really does bode well for the remaining race this season, that it won't be a Verstappen and Red Bull walkover.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we've got top 4 finished within 14 seconds of one another. Top 2 finished within 7 tenths. And I'll dive into why I found it exciting. Probably because it's all, I think I was looking at it contextually. So comparative to what we've been experiencing the past few years, just to see a car able to chase down the leader and eat up that gap and even get close was enough to sort of, stoke a bit of fire in my belly. And like what you said about the Delta and everything like that. The problem with Imola, obviously, it's very narrow. These cars are very big. There's only the one DRS zone on a straight that is basically a sort of bend. It's like a banana shape, isn't it, really? So there wasn't really much opportunities for overtaking unless, you just come across someone you've just pitted or they've just pitted or there was a massive tyre offset. But I think with Norris, he obviously said he just wanted one more lap or a couple more laps. And Verstappen was having his battery issues, and Norris was approaching it at a rate of knots. I think it would have been nice if we just had one more lap, because Norris only got that DRS right at the last lap, didn't he? And by then it was too late. One more lap, and if he'd even if he'd had a go, not even to overtake, but if he'd had a go at Tamburello with one extra lap, that would have been even more exciting to see maybe them go like side by side, and you never know what sort of shenanigans could have happened. But like you said, we were very pessimistic at the start of the season when at Bahrain, Red Bull just cantered off into the distance. But now we've had 2 races in a row where they've been properly challenged. Obviously, Norris winning in Miami. And even before Miami in China, he was a fine second and lapping at a very, very good pace in the end of that race, that almost akin to Verstappen in the leading Red Bull. And I just saw a stat earlier on Twitter that apparently this is the first time in the new era of points that after the first 7 races, we've got 4 people over 100 points or something like that. I may be wrong, but I think that's how I read that stat. So that's interesting. We've actually got and it's a long season as well. So there's going to be I think more venues and more instances like this where it looks like Red Bull will trip up and the others are now close enough to fight them. It means that each and every weekend isn't a foregone conclusion, especially with how close qualifying is as well. I think we saw Piastri had his grid penalty, so he got stuck out of position, and he just sort of got stuck. But if you could qualify well, you could genuinely challenge. So, yes, all good, I think. Red Bull. Should we talk about Red Bull? A terrible Friday for them, for Red Bull. I mean, it would have been an amazing Friday for like a Williams, but it was a terrible Friday for a Red Bull because they were off the pace and really complaining with the balance of their car, and you saw Verstappen going off. And then Saturday morning, it didn't look that good. And then in qualifying, Verstappen obviously pulled it out the bag to take pole by a very narrow margin, under a tenth, I believe. And with a little help from Nico Hülkenberg giving him a tow. Perez obviously had his struggles and didn't get out of Q2. But then, obviously, Red Bull managed to turn it around on the Verstappen side of the camp to pick up the win. So it's a very good recovery from them.
Yes, they looked nowhere on Friday. It's kind of been a recurring theme this season, or at least it's been more prominent this term compared to last. And I don't know if it's because the other teams are closing in, or the changes Red Bull have made to their car, like the innovations they brought, instead of just kind of adopting a process of evolution. Maybe that's kind of upset the balance a little bit. But both Australia, Miami, and now Imola, 3 out of the opening 7 races, they've not been entirely comfortable. We didn't really hear that last season, other than Singapore. Like, they always seem to be on song and just hit the ground running. But obviously Red Bull, they can rely on the Verstappen factor, and I think this weekend kind of showed that he doesn't always need a dominant car to win. That argument kind of got floated around quite a bit in the last year or last 18 months because of how dominant Red Bull have been, and his comments about preferring just to lead out front rather than actually battle for it. But I'd say in qualifying, McLaren had the faster car, and it was Verstappen that pulled it out. His final lap was ridiculously good. It was on the limit, fully committed, and ultimately that won in the race, because if McLaren had got grid position, we saw how vital that was this weekend. And if he'd have started behind the McLarens, I think Verstappen wouldn't have been able to overtake them, and we would have been looking at another Norris win. So I think it's a credit to the entire team with how they responded from Friday, both trackside and back at the factory. Horner was, giving credit to the likes of Sebastian Buemi, simulator driver, and the team back at the Milton Keynes base for doing an overnight deep dive into what had gone wrong on the Friday, and they came back on the Saturday and it instantly looked better. And Verstappen nailed it when Perez stumbled at the second hurdle in qualifying. And going on to Perez, Monaco's a critical time for him, because it was Monaco last year where his trouble started. That run of consecutive races not being in Q3. Imola kind of had the hallmarks of that. It looked similar to what it was last season. He's confident it's a blip. Horner's confident it's a blip. It's a difficult one to judge, because his start to the season has been a lot more consistent, but there have been signs in recent rounds that he is not quite there again. China, he didn't come second. He got beat by Norris and wasn't able to even close the gap to Norris in the final stint. Miami, his qualifying was okay, but in the race he was nowhere. Even in that opening stint,
he was in a race with a Mercedes, wasn't he? In Miami?
Well, yeah, he was. And like I said, he was nowhere near the top 3 in the opening stint, and he was coming under pressure from Norris behind. And then this weekend was just a disaster for him. Crashed in FP3 at the Variante Alta chicane. Qualifying, he blamed having to use an extra set in Q1, but that's also down to him not having the pace to, be secure like Verstappen to make it through just the one set. So he kind of was the architect of his own downfall, really. And when he was 11th, with the track being so difficult to overtake on, and actually the hard tyre didn't look like a great race tyre. A lot of drivers struggled on it, especially with the temperature, which I'm sure we'll get onto in a second with talking about Norris and his late charge and how that changed the dynamic of the race. he got swamped when other drivers pitted, and that kind of resigned him to, at best, being the worst of the leading 4 teams home, and that's how it transpired. He came home 8th, 54.7 seconds off Verstappen, and 7 seconds behind George Russell, who pitted twice. So, yeah, quite an anonymous race for Perez, and he really needs to kickstart his campaign again in Monaco.
Yes, 100%. And he obviously had that off at Ravazza in the race as well, which didn't help his cause.
Yes, he believes that caused him damage as well. So, I mean, his pace wasn't spectacular beforehand, but he kind of then just really did drop off a cliff on the second part of that hard stint. And I think Red Bull were angling for either a safety car to come, which never did, or to, do a hard, soft strategy. But his pace was just nowhere, so they kind of had to pit him quite early onto the mediums.
Yes, not a great look for him, bless him. But McLaren, yes, let's get on to McLaren's race a little bit more. Obviously, sort of Piastri's 3-place grid penalty up for impeding Kevin Magnussen in the first session of qualifying basically sort of ended his race essentially. So he was out of the picture for the fight at the front, which he very well could have been. And also talking again about Haas, the Nico Hülkenberg toe arguably was the missing ingredient that helped Verstappen leapfrog the 2 McLarens to take pole. So without a penalty, without a Hülkenberg toe, we could have been looking at a McLaren 1-2 on the grid, and then we would have had a very different race. But Norris was the sole papaya car really in the challenge for victory. But after those rounds of pit stops, it didn't look like it was going to happen. He was sort of several seconds trailing back from Verstappen, and then he was getting the pressure from Leclerc. And as you said, he was really struggling to switch on those hard tyres, or he was just nursing them. Because once he did get them switched on, we had that 10-lap burst at the end where he really reined Verstappen in. So yeah, just talk us through a little bit from your perspective, because I know you've been deep diving into this, about what it was about Norris's second stint in the race and how he managed it.
Yeah, so I've done a piece up on our website, motorsportweek.com, kind of delving into the factors that conspired to have this close finale. And it was all down to the tyres. As Andrea Stella put it, post-race, the tyres were so sensitive, and, getting into that sweet spot of the temperature range was so minor that it had a big overriding marker on how the race kind of went. So more than just outright car performance, it was also the tyres that played a big role and kind of capped how much a team could extract from their car. And through the opening stint, McLaren were hampered by a lot of rear degradation on the mediums. They then had to cover off Leclerc's potential undercut threat. And at that stage, it did look like it was a case of McLaren against Ferrari for second best and Verstappen sauntering ahead out front. But that all changed around lap 45 when Norris, for the first time really, actually took time out of Verstappen, and then a few laps later took a whole second out of him. And at that point, the gap was still about 6.5 seconds, so you were kind of expecting at some stage Verstappen to re-engage and get back on the gas. But we heard a radio exchange between him and his engineer, Gianpiero Lambiase, where Verstappen literally admitted he didn't have pace in reserve. That was the maximum he could extract. And at that point, you are thinking, okay, the chase is on if Norris can keep up this pace. Horner said post-race, Verstappen basically just lost all temperature in the hard tyre. And whether you undercut the tyres or overcut the tyres, once you dropped out of that window, your pace would just fall off a cliff. And whereas Norris had struggled in the first stint, he'd actually, brought the tyres in the second stint, mindful of how much further he had to go on his second stint. And it paid dividends for him because he had that tyre life at the end, and he also made some alterations on his steering wheel that kind of killed the fronts to protect the rears. And with a number of laps, that really did aid his pursuit. He kind of got into a sweet spot, and it just shows how fine the balance is now, I think, going forward, because it's not just going to be on, who has the quicker car between McLaren, Ferrari, Red Bull, potentially Mercedes down the line. It's going to be like minute factors like this, who gets the tyres in the best window, and especially at a place like Monaco where the margins are so small, it will be those tiny factors that dictate who's ahead in that leading battle. One thing to keep an eye on, I would say, is Norris was quite candid post-race about McLaren struggling in hotter temperatures. And obviously we're heading into the summer now. Summertime in Europe, most races will be, searing heat. Will that be an Achilles heel that hampers their pursuit? I think that's a really interesting dynamic to keep an eye on.
Yes, and perhaps maybe they need to keep an eye on the likes of Canada and Silverstone where it could be a bit cooler. But yeah, moving on to Ferrari. They were, I would say, a firm third best at Imola this weekend. There was obviously a lot of hype around the upgrade package that they brought to the car, but other teams are bringing upgrades. I mean, Red Bull were bringing upgrades, so obviously the sort of the yardstick does move a little bit. But yeah, Ferrari, obviously, again, it's their qualifying issues in their final run. I think both Sainz and Leclerc had a terrible first sector, so that kind of just resigned them to where they were on the grid. And you couldn't really do much from there. I mean, Leclerc did well, obviously, to sort of keep tabs on Lando for a bit there and obviously come home in third to get a podium in front of the Tifosi. But yes, Ferrari didn't look like they had quite enough to challenge McLaren and Red Bull.
No, it looked at the start of that second stint when Norris was kind of easing his tyres in, or it was kind of going back to McLaren quickly. It was a bit of Norris kind of contradicted himself a little bit post-race because he said that he was being mindful to bring the tyres in, but then he was also saying that he genuinely couldn't push more at that point. It was a case of the fact that was his genuine pace at that point, and Leclerc was piling the pressure on until Leclerc had a moment at the chicane, Variante Alta chicane, and that sent him across the grass, and I think that overcooked his tyres. And as we've touched on, once you kind of get into that predicament, it's very hard to bring it back. So I think at that point, Leclerc was kind of resigned to just finish in third, and I think even if he kept up his pace, overtaking was so difficult that he wouldn't have been able to get past Norris, especially with Ferrari had quite a bit of drag this weekend, or more drag than the likes of Red Bull and I think McLaren. Their top end speed wasn't great, and Leclerc kind of hinted to, or not even hinted, he did explain post qualifying that Red Bull and McLaren had a kind of an advantage on power down to Tamburello in qualifying, and he thinks that's where most of the time loss in Sector 1 was. So rather than it being a case of their tyre warm-up issues coming back to haunt them again, it was something else this time. And I think once they get on top of that, they're definitely in the mix. They're definitely there with Red Bull. I think Ferrari have now got a base that's really strong. Their upgrades worked. They did what they expected them to do. They're now at that point where they've just got those minute details that they're lacking to Red Bull. And I'm talking the sort of things where Leclerc mentioned their car didn't ride the curbs as well as the McLaren or the Red Bull. He tried to do what Verstappen did after reviewing his onboard footage, and he couldn't do it. The car wouldn't allow him to do it. That's been a strength of Ferraris in previous years. So, kind of getting that all-round package is what Ferrari are missing now. They've ironed out the big weaknesses, but it's compromised some of their strengths, and they just kind of need to rein that back in and just get those really fine factors nailed, and I think they're there with Red Bull.
Yes, I agree. And I think that is the name of the game now, isn't it? When you get into a third year of a rule cycle, it's about those subtle tweaks and those marginal gains and getting that overall package that is the way to win, essentially. Which is going to be difficult for Ferrari because, I mean, they said Imola wasn't the best circuit for them to bring an upgrade package in terms of pace. Obviously, logistically and timing-wise, it all made sense for them. And then obviously you've now got Monaco, which again isn't a typical Formula 1 circuit. So it's going to take time for them to sort all that out. But talking about time, upgrades, trying to figure out what you're doing with your car, these are all the bugbears of the Brackley-based Mercedes squad, who were firmly fourth best in Imola, finishing 6th and 7th, Hamilton ahead of Russell. And they were in a race by themselves. They didn't have anything to do with challenging those in front. And they were sort of, in a bubble and had enough pace to protect themselves from those behind, which essentially is the midfield and Perez. I think they were happier. Obviously, they've been bringing upgrades to their car as well. I think they're happier that they've got a car that they can at least drive without it being a nightmare. And now it's just they're now on that, that mountain to climb of just putting more pace into the W15. But it's an interesting one, Mercedes. I think. I mean, honestly, watching the race, I just wasn't really aware of what they were doing because there was just no interest in their race, them being in that bubble. And it's again, we've talked about this a lot. It's a far cry from what they used to be, but now we're just talking about them being this sort of team trying desperately to catch up what is the 3 leading teams.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. They were anonymous, just 4th best, behind the top 3, clear of Aston Martin, who we'll touch on shortly. But I do think this was a promising weekend for Mercedes. They brought upgrades. They appeared to work, so maybe they've got over their correlation issues, or it seems they have. And reading the quotes from the teams, both George Russell on Thursday and then Toto Wolff post-race with his media session, they've both mentioned that Mercedes now have a clear direction, which they've not had for the last 2 years under this regulation cycle. And that bodes well because if they've now got a solid platform and they know where to add the downforce and, dictate the aero configuration to the right direction, then it's not a simple task, but at least they're not problem solving and they've got something they can work with. They've got upgrades coming in the next few rounds, and I really do feel like they are making progress. The gap at Imola, we'll see whether it was track specific, but it was reduced compared to the past few races. And if they're as confident as it seems they are, I think by the end of the season, they're not necessarily going to be in the top 3 battle because it's a moving goalpost. Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren aren't standing still. But I think Mercedes will be a lot closer than what they've started the season with relatively. And going into next year, if they kind of continue on this path with James Allison overseeing the technical department, then I don't think they'll be in a title challenge next year. But it seems like they've kind of got over the problems that have kind of hampered them the last few years.
Yes, let's hope so. Although they did say after the 2022 season that they'd learned what went wrong and they knew what they were doing. So we've been here before. Hopefully there's a little bit more, I guess, fact or evidence behind their words. There was also a little bit of a hoo-ha over team radio at the end for the Mercedes drivers. Obviously, George Russell was running ahead of Hamilton, but his tyres were ebbing away, and he was instructed to pit an extra time to go for that fastest lap, and he didn't seem too pleased with the instruction. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, did he then ask if they could swap the positions back?
Yes, I believe so. I've seen that bandied around. Yeah. Made no odds. They got the same. I think post-race, he was actually kind of like out of the heat of the moment. He was a bit more on like feet on the ground about it and sensible that they got the... It wasn't a case that he lost a place to a rival. He lost a place to the sister car and they gained a point for fastest lap. So... And Toto said as well that Russell probably would have got passed by Hamilton anyway, because I think his tyres were about 6 laps older, and they were wary of the threat of Perez coming on medium tyres. So, it made sense to do it if they were concerned, because at the end of the day, they gained a point out of it. So, not much of a big deal.
Yeah, one of those classic in the heat of the moment, driver doesn't want to see their teammate finishing ahead of them, which is natural, I think, but did make for some interesting fodder for journalists and fans to sort of sink their teeth into after the race. So maybe make the Mercedes Imola Grand Prix a bit more interesting. Moving on, Aston Martin. I think we can probably say, it's fair to say, they were in the midfield at Imola, and it wasn't the usual or the open start of the season top 5 teams, bottom 5 teams situation, which is probably a concern for Aston Martin, considering they brought on the largest upgrade package, I think, of any of the teams going to Emilia Romagna. And it really didn't work for them this past weekend in Italy. Their qualifying prowess seemingly deserted them. And they didn't. I mean, they executed a good enough race to recover. Alonso obviously had his off in the final practice session, which obviously compromised his Saturday because it was a rush to get his car ready in time for Q1. It was a scrappy Q1. Eventually, they sort of aborted his final lap attempt. So he was originally placed 19th, and then they, broke the parc fermé to make some setup tweaks on the car. Started in the pit lane. It was essentially a test session for him. He was also used as sort of a trigger to pit early and help Lance Stroll out, who went on this. He qualified, I think Lance Stroll was qualified 13th or something. It was a Q2 exit. It wasn't a sensational qualifying for him either. But a mega long opening stint helped him get into the points with 9th place, with some gutsy overtaking moves as well. So, they salvaged something from what was a pretty bleak weekend.
Yeah, and I think, obviously, irrespective of how their car performed and how the upgrades performed, the actual teamwork was spot on, because Crack alluded to the fact that with Alonso basically running a glorified test session, they started him on the soft tyre and pitted him on, I think, the end of lap 7, which triggered RB and Haas to respond, and that kind of opened the door for Lance Stroll to run an extended first stint, then come in later on, and then he used his offset on tyres to dispatch Hulkenberg and Tsunoda, and he took a 9th place, which was better than they probably expected, and it showed good teamwork amid a difficult weekend, because they are just the 5th fastest team now, and obviously Lance Stroll's not the best qualifying benchmark, but even at the start of the season, with that car being so good over one lap, Stroll was still getting into Q3, and then you had Alonso, in Saudi Arabia, he got 3rd, so that car has inherent pace on certain conditions, but it just seems like they're slipping backwards relative to the rest. And Alonso said on Thursday that he's impressed with last season he said they asked him, I need to adapt to being a top team and that intense development race, and they're bringing upgrades every race, but it's actually not taking them where they thought. And I wonder if it's a correlation issue, because they had to use the Mercedes wind tunnel, I believe. Is there correlation? Because Mercedes have correlation problems, so is that linked directly? Who knows? It's a question that will need to be asked to Aston Martin, I think, because I get the sense they were disappointed with their upgrades this weekend. It's only one race. It could just be it was a bad track for their car, or they didn't get the setup right with the upgrade. Because that is a big point I think people miss with upgrades, is adapting your setup to the upgrades. Jock Clare of Ferrari was quite clear on that. It will take time, many races to, get the right setup for the upgrades, because the car behaviour can change, and that's one thing that happened with Aston Martin. It made the car more difficult to drive, and that was partly responsible for the accidents that Alonso had, because I think that was, you could say, one of Alonso's worst weekends. He's very quick to hype up his good weekends and list them in his top 5, but if we are ranking his worst weekends, there's not been many in his F1 career, because he is usually so consistent. That would, I think, be in his worst 5 races, because it was his fault. Like that crash in FP3, that was very unlike Alonso. You very rarely see him even spin, let alone, put it in the barrier. And then he had that off in qualifying, which I'd imagine damaged his floor, and that, could tell his weekend. One to forget for Alonso, but and I think Stroll deserves a lot of credit, because he salvaged, when Alonso wasn't there, he salvaged a result for Aston Martin, and you can't often say that about Lance Stroll. So, he deserves a lot of credit for his weekend performance.
Really strong tyre management on the mediums in his opening stint. But I think for Aston Martin, it's similar to last year. Obviously, they started well and they started bolting upgrades on, and it didn't have the desired effect, and they slipped back. And I think the only difference in 2023 is that they started off as the 2nd fastest team, whereas this year they've started off as the 5th fastest team, which isn't optimal. And I think, like you said, I don't think it's going to be a case of, well, it doesn't look like it's going to be a case of them trying to charge forward. It's now looking like they're going to be, looking over their shoulders at the likes of RB and Haas, who, especially in qualifying, had a really good showing. I mean, we got two RBs into Q3. Tsunoda qualified 7th after appearing in the top 5 in the previous 2 sessions. He was angry with 7th, and obviously Ricciardo got into Q3 and as well. And if it wasn't for obviously Aston Martin's sort of tactical nous, RB maybe could have got something a bit more out of their weekend. And likewise, Nico Hulkenberg, who, as ever, is incredible over one lap and got his Haas into Q3 as well. So yeah, I think Aston Martin need to be careful not to be. I mean, the RB squad are really looking in good shape in my opinion, and Yuki Tsunoda I think is in a really good sort of vein of form, and Ricciardo I think he's getting there as well. I think he's having more. It looks like he's starting to have more good days than bad days. And I think just the metric of what a good day for Ricciardo is has changed from what we thought it would be in the off-season. It's now he needs to be close to Tsunoda, and then that's, I think we could probably class that as a good day now. But yeah, how did you read? Obviously, Haas and RB, they're definitely sort of the front of the midfield pack chasing at Aston Martin's tail, aren't they?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. More RB than Haas, and I think we've both said that on previous podcasts. We'd back RB with the Red Bull back in to stand the test of time in the development race and close that gap to the leading five. And I think Tsunoda and Ricciardo have actually taken quite a lot of enthusiasm from the team's Miami upgrades. Last 2 rounds, they've Tsunoda pulled away from a Mercedes in Miami, and then he split the Mercedes on the grid at Imola. And if there was one hitch that you could criticise about RB's performance, it was the starts, and Tsunoda's touched on that. They need to, because that ultimately made them lose a position to Stroll, because Tsunoda getting caught out by Hulkenberg at the start meant that they had to, adopt an aggressive strategy to gain the position back, but then it meant they were vulnerable to Stroll later on. So that's one area that is a very fine area. It's one that's overlooked quite a bit, the role that teams can have in start performance, but it is so essential when you do get racetracks like this where it kind of settles into an orderly fashion and grid position does dictate where you finish more often than not. Tsunoda was really impressive again. Like he's all but, I'd say, secured his F1 future for next year, because up until this season, although there were signs that he'd improved last year, it's still a case of if he started the season badly, he was definitely not secure on the grid. If he was getting beaten by Ricciardo with Lawson in the wings, you have to say Tsunoda was looking like he was heading out the door. But I'd say his start to the season, even if he does encounter a bit of a dip in form, this start that he's made and, delivering on that promise that he's always shown in F1 has meant that RB would like to keep him next year. And he may even be an attractive proposition to other teams. We've heard of rumours about Haas, if he wants to exit the Red Bull stable. I think staying at RB is a wise option, because although it's never going to be a top team, at least it's a competitive seat at the moment, and they have actually got aspirations to progress beyond just being a lower midfield team. They do want to kind of be their own team in a sense, and make those gains on their rivals. Looking at Ricciardo, yeah, I'd agree with you. I think with Ricciardo, there's a patience game. Laura Mecky's RB team principal has spoken about there's certain limitations that were holding him back in the opening race, and they're kind of slowly dialing those out. There will be upgrades coming that will help him further. And I noticed throughout the weekend that it was Sector 1 where he was struggling compared to Tsunoda. And considering where he was in practice, to be within 2/10 in qualifying was actually a pretty impressive effort. And it was just a case of he was on the fringe of the top 10, a bad start, dropped him out of it, and then he was kind of out of points contention. But his Red Bull hopes, I'd say they're gone for next year. I think at this moment in time, it's Perez's seat to lose unless he has an absolute stinker like he did last season. But we both said earlier in the season that it looked like Ricciardo's time in F1 could be up, because his ambition isn't to remain in the midfield. But he's showing enough signs now, I'd say, to earn another season if he carries on at this rate that he's on. Because at the end of the day, I think it's understated a driver's role off the track. RB have been very open about how he's kind of changed the mentality of the team, or how he's unlocked setup avenues that they hadn't thought to try when he came in last year. And I think he's actually been a driving force behind their progress. So it's easy to look at performance and say, oh, he's not matching Tsunoda. They've got Lawson waiting, shoehorn Lawson into the seat alongside Tsunoda. But I think Ricciardo brings so many benefits also off the track that's a good lineup. If it wasn't a case of RB being a proving ground for Red Bull drivers, a Tsunoda Ricciardo midfield lineup is a top tier lineup. That's probably like the best lineup in the midfield you're going to get. So it's unfortunate for Lawson because he does deserve his chance, but it's just a case of 3 and 2 won't go. And it's going to be really interesting to see what Red Bull do with those 2 seats, because Tsunoda's staking his claim to hang on to his seat for a 5th season, and I think Ricciardo's kind of bringing himself into the mix to show that he has still got life left in F1.
Yeah, I think for all the reasons you said, Tsunoda definitely, I think, staying at RB makes the most sense for him. I feel like Haas is a sideways step or a step back just because of maybe the means that are at that team's disposal. And it does look like Red Bull aren't that interested in promoting Tsunoda. And then Ricciardo as well. I think as long as he keeps his form up, there's all those benefits you mentioned, and then, not even mentioning the marketing benefits of having Ricciardo on board. And yes, it's sad for Liam Lawson, but if you've got 2 drivers who are sort of, giving you the car's potential and putting it on the track and getting results, and there's no need to change things up, perhaps Lawson needs to look outside of Red Bull to try and wiggle his way into a Formula One drive on a permanent basis. It's going to be difficult because there's a few sort of rookies and fringe drivers who are, potentially getting seats, Ollie Behrmans and the Kimi Antonellis of the world. But anyway, yes, RB are looking good. And then also, as you said, they used to be a Red Bull proving ground for talent. I don't really think they are that anymore. So their driver lineup does make sense. And we see it in the other teams. You've got like former Grand Prix winner Valtteri Bottas. He's not at the level that a top team would want him at anymore, but he has the experience and he still has the sort of latent speed that makes him a really valuable asset to midfield teams. And it's why he's confident that he's not going to be going anywhere outside of Formula One next season as well. But moving on from Haas and RB, our sort of strong midfield candidates, we should move into maybe our anonymous back of the field stragglers, for want of a better word, because that's maybe a bit harsh. But Alpine, again, still not looking like a works team should look, but obviously they're making steady gains, whereas they're not going out in Q1, they're getting into Q2, but they're not really troubling any further forward. They're not really on the fringe of the points candidate, or especially they weren't in Imola. And obviously Sauber just, lacking pace. And Williams, well, it turns out they have quite a heavy car, which is probably what's holding them back quite a bit, considering they've eradicated the peakiness or the weaknesses of their previous iterations of ground effect machines. But it's a bit heavy, so it's probably why they're struggling. Obviously, Albon had his disaster pit stop, which with the loose wheel, so that kind of ruined his race. But yeah, I mean, not a lot to write home about for either of those 3, is there really?
No, honestly, I do the race report for the site every weekend, and I can't remember really mentioning any of the bottom 3 teams, with the exception of Albon's loose wheel, which he didn't get penalised for. He didn't get penalised for driving with a loose wheel. He just got penalised for the unsafe release, which, yeah, I said that ruined his prospects and turned his race into a glorified test session like Alonso's. And then I think it was just a case of that's where those bottom 3 teams are, that's where they qualify, and that's where they're going to finish at a track like Imola. So, yeah, not much. I think most of the talking points surrounding the bottom 3 teams is kind of the driver market and what's happening there. Ocon reiterated his Mercedes ties on Thursday. I think both him and Gasly are kind of in an awkward position where they'd be open to leaving Alpine because of the progress that's not being made, but the seats aren't really available, and it's a case of remaining with a struggling manufacturer is better than being with an independent team with a ceiling like Haas. Alpine, they have at least made staff changes that kind of showed they're trying to turn a new page. We've seen that so many times at Team Enstone since they came back into F1, that whether actually, anything comes to fruition, doubtful. but at least they're actually being proactive and hiring staff and trying to change their current predicament. Then you can look at Sauber. It looks like Bottas and Joe are both out. Hulkenberg's already signed. Bottas is really confident in his futures in F1, which leads me to think that his meeting with Williams at the motorhome with James Vowles on Saturday, that deal could be close, because James Vowles said they're assessing 3 options and there will be news in the next few weeks. And that comes right as Bottas has visited Vowles to have a discussion in the Williams motorhome. And Bottas saying that he's 99% sure he'll be on the grid. So adding 2 and 2 together, it looks like it could be Bottas to Williams alongside Albon, which was a really strong lineup. And I think it's a good fit for Bottas because, as you alluded to, he's still very quick. He's got a lot of experience. And the vibe I get from Williams is quite good at the moment. They've taken a step back relatively because they made a more all-rounded car. They had to eradicate the limitations that were embedded over previous regulation cycles. And while it's not, delivering them anything in the short term, long term they seem really confident, especially Albon, about the progress they're making. And I think Albon, taking himself off the driver market, not just for next year, but for the future, is a really big vote of confidence in what James Vowles is trying to build there. So having Bottas alongside Albon, it's a really strong lineup, and it gives Williams a dynamic they've not had in so many years. You look back to the Russell Latifi lineup,
Russell Kubica,
yeah, and then Albon Latifi and Albon Sargent. It's been a one driver show. They've had one driver who looks like they could bring points home each weekend, whereas Bottas and Albon, you'd have 2 drivers who will push each other, and that will only help the team. So yeah, I think that's a good fit. Sauber, Audi, looks like Sainz's only option. I think Mercedes have kind of moved on past that. They might have offered him a short-term deal that wasn't really suitable for Sainz's side. And Wolff's admitted that they're willing to make compromises on losing Sainz to someone like Audi to kind of assess how the market goes as he holds out faint hope for Verstappen. So it looks like Antonelli could be the option for Mercedes. And now that doesn't need to be announced now because he's under the Mercedes umbrella, so they can take their time on that one. So yeah, I think with the I've kind of diverted away from the conversation, but with those bottom teams, with not even how far they are for the pace, but their chances of scoring points at the moment are quite limited unless we have a chaotic race. So most of the attention's kind of on what's happening behind the scenes with the driver market.
Yes, I mean, bless them, Ocon and Gasly, I think they're probably resigned to the team they're in, although apparently Haas are keen on Ocon, but whether he's keen on jumping aboard to the Haas project is another kettle of fish. And like you said, I really like the idea of Bottas to Williams, and you saying they've been a one driver lineup. I'm just thinking back, because before the days of Russell and Kubica and driver lineups like that, you had like Stroll and Sirotkin. So I'm thinking the last time they had a really decent 2-driver lineup was Bottas and Massa.
Yes, and Massa was kind of at the end of his career. He still had some flashes of his previous Ferrari speed, but this is also post-accident Massa that wasn't quite at the same level. So it's been a while since Williams kind of had 2 drivers who you'd say are on an equal footing, and I think Bottas and Albon are exactly that.
And then I think what's really important as well is Bottas is a good qualifier. And I think that's so important for these midfield teams that are fighting for position, and especially in F1 where qualifying is so important, to have someone who can, you're seeing it with Haas. Hulkenberg puts Haas in such a good position with his qualifying performances. So Williams could do with, because Albon we know is quite a good qualifier, and we know Bottas is a good qualifier, so they could really do with something like that. You say Albon, he's got that long-term deal sorted up. Bottas wants a long-term deal, so it's going to bring so much stability to a team like Williams. And yeah, like we said, they've got rid of the sort of the weaknesses of the peakiness of their car. If they can shed the weight, then there might be some speed hiding in there as well. So things looking good for them, I think, if they can secure the Finn Australian, I think we can call him now, Bottas for their team, for their driver lineup next year. Speaking of qualifying and its importance in Formula One, that was no more important at Imola. I mean, because of its difficulty of overtaking, and we had some drivers after the race even complaining that it was boring. I think Daniel Ricciardo said it was a boring race. I'm pretty sure Alonso said it was a boring race. There's 2 Italian circuits on the F1 calendar, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe both are out of contract next season. So there's a lot of talk about potentially which one should be kept, Imola or Monza. Taylor, give me your thoughts on that.
It's got to be Monza. I mean, Imola, it garners a great atmosphere with the Tifosi, and it's kind of like your old school circuit. The drivers love it. But if it came down to choice between would you rather have Monza or Imola, you'd have to go Monza just purely because of the history behind the circuit. It's the home of, although Imola's closer to Maranello, if I'm not mistaken, Monza is viewed as the traditional home of Ferrari. The sight of them waving the flag on the start-finish straight below the podium is always a great sight. And it's also just better for overtaking it. And it's Imola does have its unique selling points as a circuit, but I also think Monza is more unique in the fact that you don't really get, I mean, you could argue Las Vegas is now the same, but you've got that track where it's kind of tailored for those teams that have got a car that goes well in low downforce circuits. You've got like the flat out blast separated by the slow speed chicanes, or the racing can be hit and miss there, but yeah, just the heritage behind Monza and what it means for Formula One and for Ferrari, I don't think there could be an argument. And I think Imola's days are probably numbered. Maybe it could strike a deal where it, does alternate years. That's been talked about with some of the European venues. I don't know which kind of race it would alternate with, because it would make sense for it to be Monza, but I also don't think Monza would be willing to give up hosting the race every year. So, yeah, Imola could fight itself off the calendar again, and while it would be a miss for, watching qualifying laps, we also get that at Monaco. So, weighing up the pros and cons, I'd rather keep Monza over Imola.
I 100% agree with you. Also, Monza are putting a significant amount of investment to improve their Grand Prix facility, including resurfacing and sorting out infrastructure and all like that to keep up to the standard of what a modern Grand Prix venue needs to be. So I think they're making the necessary steps to ensure their future. As you said, it's the sort of spiritual home of the Tifosi and Ferrari in terms of Formula One. It does produce better racing than Imola as well. And I think it's got more history. I mean, obviously Imola's a historic circuit, but Monza's got more history on its side because I think it's been on every single calendar in Formula One's history. I think it's the longest serving and the only one that's circuit, and it's the only one that's been on every year. If I'm wrong, I'm sure someone will tell me, but I'm pretty sure I'm right on that front. So yes, I would keep Monza over Imola. Imola, I think, has served its purpose. It came in to help in the sort of the COVID period where some circuits couldn't obviously facilitate having a Grand Prix due to the pandemic. And it's sort of earned a place after that, but I think it doesn't really suit these cars. It was great for Formula 3, and Formula 2 as well had good races, but for other things, it's a good circuit in the WEC, and World Superbikes and stuff like that over the years have had some great races there, but maybe not suited for Formula 1. I guess we're talking about circuits suited for Formula 1. We're going to Monaco next. I mean, if we're talking about how big Formula 1 cars are now and how difficult it is to overtake, Monaco is really it's probably the furthest extreme in that regard. It's all about qualifying at Monaco. I do think Monaco probably still gets its place on the calendar. It has maybe too much prestige on its side to lose its place, even though there's maybe some talk whether it should or not. But that aside, let's do a little prediction. Who do we think's going to go well this weekend in the Monaco Grand Prix?
I mean, just going back to your point quickly about the cars being too big for Monaco now. I mean, the thing that really flagged that up for me was viewing the footage from I think it was the historic Grand Prix a few weeks ago, which Adrian Newey competed in, and seeing how small the classic cars looked compared to the cars we've got now, and yeah, it's no wonder why. Even in like those older years, you didn't moves at Monaco were tough, but because the cars were lighter, smaller, more agile, drivers were more encouraged to send moves down the inside at like Raskas. Whereas now it's just too much of a risk and they're too heavy and cumbersome to even attempt those sort of moves in the dry. Looking ahead to the pecking order, Monaco's an outlier. You can't really base precedents from other circuits to Monaco because of how unique it is. And I think Norris put it best when he was asked about McLaren's, slow speed deficiency maybe being a weakness at Monaco, and he pointed out that when you have a certain weakness, it doesn't necessarily translate to Monaco. He doesn't expect their slow speed weakness to be exposed at Monaco, and it will all come down to qualifying. Whoever gets pole positions in the box seat, and with Verstappen's form over one lap, it'd be hard to look past him. But you also see Red Bull kind of playing down their chances there. They expect it to be a struggle, and maybe they will be relying on Verstappen's prowess in low fuel conditions to get them over the line in that one. I think McLaren will be a threat. They've had good qualifying pace. Piastri, I think, is a dark horse. I can't remember how he did at Monaco last year. I know McLaren obviously weren't at the competitiveness they are now, and it was only 6 races into his F1 career. But Piastri, raw pace, he can match Norris. The only thing he's missing is now race management, and that's something that will come. We saw Norris against Sainz in their first years together. Sainz had the edge in race trim, but in qualifying they are equal, and that's kind of what I feel like Piastri's being judged maybe too harshly with his race management, because it's something that will come, and he's up against someone that's one of the best drivers in the sport and has now 5-6 seasons of competition under his belt. So it's not really a fair comparison. But if there's a time where Piastri will pull out another qualifying special and be able to actually maintain it in the race, it's here. So I'd still give Verstappen the edge for the weekend, but I'm going to predict that Piastri could be his nearest challenger. I'm going to go with that.
I like it. Almost a hot take. But I think you're right. Yeah, it's going to be down to qualifying. We saw last year Verstappen had a challenge from Alonso for pole, and it was very, very close. And obviously rain in the race actually made things quite interesting. Yes, I think it's going to be a McLaren Red Bull fight again. I'm going to be sort of impartial and just sort of, I'm not going to pick who, because honestly, it's very hard to predict now qualifying, which is exciting. But yes, it's going to be McLaren versus Verstappen for the 3rd race in a row, I suppose. And I'm looking forward to it, which is good. We're in a place now where Formula One is stoking some excitement, which I think is a fine place to end. And Taylor, thank you for joining me. And listeners, thank you for joining us as we chit-chat about Imola, and we chit-chat briefly about Monza and briefly about Monaco. But yes, stay up to date with the podcast Motorsport Speak on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, on YouTube, wherever you wish to go. Keep up to date with motorsportweek.com and Motorsport Monday, our free-to-read weekly digital magazine, which you can also catch on Press Reader if you want a mobile-friendly reading experience. Keep up to date with us on socials at Motorsport Week on X, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, maybe even LinkedIn. Maybe. And also, it's not just Formula One this weekend, it's the Indy 500. So keep up to date across all our media offering to see the greatest spectacle in racing and how it unfolds. We also have the Shanghai E-Prix and MotoGP's back in action at Catalunya. So there's 2 and 4 wheels for everybody to enjoy. But for now, from us, goodbye.